Today, we're dropping Dragon Ball Z's son Goten, one of the most underestimated Saiyans in the franchise, directly into the paranoid, hyper-defensive world of the Marvel Universe. And this isn't just a power-scaling debate. This is the story of how Marvel Earth nearly destroyed itself, simply because it forgot to ask a frightened kid if he was okay. Let's begin. No one in Manhattan understood why the sky cracked. No storm warning, no seismic alarm, no shield notification pinging anyone's phone, just clear, pale, ordinary blue. And then a vertical tear blazing gold and white, ripping the atmosphere apart like wet paper. 3 news drones burned out their sensors before transmitting a single frame, and through that wound in the sky, something fell. Small, fast, smiling. He hit the street 3 blocks north of Avengers Tower. The crater was 40 feet across, maybe 50. The kind of impact zone you'd expect from a meteorite. Not a child in casual clothes, completely unharmed, already looking around with wide, curious eyes like he'd just stepped off a carnival ride. Dust rolled outward in a perfect circle. Car alarms screamed in every direction. A taxicab was embedded in the side of a building 12 feet off the ground. And Goten's son brushed concrete dust off his shoulder and tilted his head at the skyline, like a tourist who'd arrived in the wrong city. He was 13 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and his power level, even at base, even calm, even just standing there looking at pigeons, would have registered as an extinction-class event on every sensor Tony Stark had ever designed, if those sensors had any reference point at all. They didn't. Friday flagged the dimensional breach in 4 seconds. She classified the energy as unknown. She flagged the entity as humanoid, juvenile, non-aggressive posture. All accurate. What she couldn't classify, what T didn't exist in any database she had access to, was the phrase casually apocalyptic. So she defaulted to priority 1 and scrambled the nearest responders. That was the first mistake. Iron Man arrived first. Of course he did. Tony Stark had never once in his life let someone else handle initial recon on a dimensional rift above his tower. He came in fast, repulsors hot, HUD already drowning in data that refused to resolve into anything useful. Goten saw him, did the most dangerous thing imaginable. He waved, friendly, casual, like spotting someone at an airport. Tony slowed, recalibrated, opened his faceplate, held up one hand, universal peace gesture, and said something diplomatic. Goten tilted his head. He didn't speak English. Not yet. What happened next was not an attack. Every after-action report would spend weeks arguing that point. It was a stretch. Goten stretched, arms wide, spine arching, the full-body stretch of a kid waking up after a long nap, and the kinetic displacement of that movement at his power level sent a $100,000 suit of armor spinning through 3 buildings before Tony could fire a single repulsor. The Quinjet holding position half a mile back rocked like a toy. Friday, reclassified to Priority 0. There was no Priority 0 before that afternoon. She invented the category in real time. The cameras caught everything. Within 6 minutes, footage of the crater and the golden tear and a small, smiling figure standing calmly in a ring of destruction was on every network simultaneously. Within 12, it was the most viewed livestream in internet history. People watching from their living rooms saw a child in a disaster zone looking faintly bored and felt 2 things at once, things that shouldn't coexist. How dangerous can he be? And immediately after, why doesn't he look scared? That second question was the one that should have terrified everyone. The answer was simple, devastating. He wasn't scared because by his standards, nothing had happened yet. And here's the thing that every protocol, every contingency, every emergency response framework completely missed. Goten wasn't an invader. He hadn't come with an army. He had no demands, no ideology, no cold logic of conquest. He had simply arrived. The way a storm arrives, the way gravity arrives, without malice, without mercy, without any awareness that his presence alone was already rewriting the threat index of an entire planet. The most dangerous thing in the Marvel Universe that Thursday morning wasn't standing on a battlefield. It was standing in a crater, watching pigeons navigate rubble, mildly curious about everything. The most dangerous invader is never the one who hates your world. It's the one who doesn't yet understand how easily he can break it. And as S.H.I.E.L.D. feeds lit up across 17 monitoring stations, as Dr. Strange felt something press against the Sanctum's wards like a finger against a bruise, as Charles Xavier sat upright in Westchester with every psychic alarm going silent at once. A different kind of silence, the silence of something outside the pattern. The question forming wasn't whether Goten would fight. The question was whether anyone in the Marvel universe was wise enough to make sure he never had a reason to. Drop a comment right now. First impressions. Do you think Marvel handles this right, or does it go wrong from the first second? Because we're about to find out. To understand why Goten's arrival was uniquely catastrophic, you have to understand what he actually was, not who. What? In the Dragon Ball universe, the word child and the word weapon don't share a sentence. Everyone understands the distinction instinctively. A child throws a tantrum. A weapon destroys infrastructure. The unbearable truth Marvel Earth was about to learn was that Goten's son managed to be both. Not by design, not by cruelty, simply by existing at the intersection of enormous power and a 13-year-old's brain. He was the son of Goku. That sentence, meaningless to every analyst, general, and superhero on Earth 616, was the single most important piece of context nobody had. In his home universe, his father had pushed the limits of mortal power so far and so consistently that Goku's son wasn't a family description. It was a warning label. Goten had inherited everything: the Saiyan genetics, the warrior instinct, the biological drive to grow stronger under pressure, and he'd inherited it at an accelerated rate that defied the already absurd developmental curve of his species. He achieved Super Saiyan at age 7, not through years of training and grief and near-death transformation the way his father had. He did it casually, almost accidentally, like discovering he could whistle. That detail would haunt every post-incident analysis. The power that took Goku years of sacrifice, the grief of watching his best friend die. Goten accessed it in a backyard sparring session with his mother. He didn't need trauma. He didn't need war. He needed nothing except a sufficiently exciting afternoon. In his universe, that wasn't even remarkable. But in a universe where the strongest baseline humans were astronauts and martial artists, where even superpowers operated within understood physical limits, that casual relationship with apocalyptic force was the single most destabilizing variable ever introduced into Earth 616's threat ecosystem. Human weapons don't register on this scale, full stop. Dr. Strange felt him before Friday flagged him, not clearly, not with the precise metaphysical clarity he usually brought to anomaly detection, more like a wrongness, a pressure against reality that didn't behave like magic, didn't behave like science, didn't fit any of the 17 categories of dimensional intrusion he'd cataloged across 2 decades. Key wasn't magic, it wasn't radiation, it wasn't psionic energy. It had evolved in a different universe, operating on entirely different rules, which meant every detection system, every containment protocol, every theoretical framework Strange had ever built was calibrated for something other than what had just arrived. He stared at his instruments for 4 full seconds, then said one word. Quietly. Different. Xavier's experience was more disorienting. He reached toward the new presence the way he reached toward all unfamiliar minds. Gently, carefully, with the practiced sensitivity of the world's most or fool telepath approaching an unknown consciousness. What he found wasn't hostility, wasn't alien incomprehensibility. What he found was a boy. Genuinely, recognizably, achingly a boy. Curious, slightly overwhelmed, searching, pushing his awareness outward in every direction with the unfocused energy of someone who'd lost their bearings and was hoping a familiar landmark would emerge from the confusion. Xavier withdrew carefully, hands folded, expression unreadable. Then he said to no one in particular, "He's looking for someone he knows." The weight of that observation settled over the room like a held breath. Meanwhile, in the places where Marvel's darker intelligences operated, the calculations ran faster and colder. Victor Von Doom received the S.H.I.E.L.D. alert 40 seconds after impact. 17 seconds before S.H.I.E.L.D. itself had finished processing it, because Doom's infrastructure was superior, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He watched the footage, ran his own sensor sweeps, cross-referenced against every dimensional intrusion in his personal archive, found nothing, no match, no precedent. An unknown power source of incalculable magnitude contained in a juvenile humanoid body with no apparent defensive posture. Doom set his fingertips together slowly. His eyes, visible above the iron mask, went completely still. "Interesting," he said, which, from Doom, was the most dangerous word in any language. The Avengers fractured before they had a plan. Tony insisted on containment first. Carol Danvers was reading satellite data and privately concluding that if this entity chose to escalate, containment was a philosophical position rather than a practical one. Natasha ran psychological profiles and arrived at a completely different conclusion than either of them. And in Westchester, the X-Men were having an entirely different conversation, one that began not with "how do we stop him," but with "how do we get there before someone does something irreversible." Multiple factions, multiple agendas, zero coordination. That pattern would cost them enormously before the day was over. Because Goten was still just sitting in the crater, he'd found a piece of rubble the right size to sit on and was watching the city with the expression of someone genuinely interested in their surroundings but increasingly aware something was wrong. Not aggressive, not posturing. The air around him shimmered with contained energy the way air shimmers above hot asphalt. Passive radiation of power so immense it was physically distorting space, even at rest. He hadn't come to invade. He hadn't come to conquer. He was 13 and alone and trying to figure out where he was. And the entire Marvel Earth was about to treat that situation as a military problem. The most expensive possible misread. And it was about to cost everyone dearly. Spider-Man got there second. And that detail matters. Because Peter Parker, swinging in from Queens with his scanner going haywire and his spider sense doing something it had never done before, not spiking, not screaming danger, but humming at a constant low frequency like a guitar string that won't stop. Peter Parker was the first person on scene who looked at Goten and thought something other than threat assessment. He thought, "That kid looks lost." He landed 20 feet away, hands up, most non-threatening voice he could manage. "Hey, you okay?" Goten looked at the red and blue suit, looked at the webbing, and despite everything, despite the displacement, the confusion, the alien skyline pressing in around him, he laughed. Short, bright, genuine. Peter had half a second to feel relieved before the second Quinjet arrived. It deployed 4 containment drones before anyone on the ground could object. Military grade, enough electromagnetic disruption to incapacitate a Hulk-class entity. They locked onto Goten's position in under 2 seconds, triangulated, fired simultaneously. A coordinated net designed to disrupt biological electrical fields and force neuromuscular shutdown in any known superhuman. The net hit Goten dead center. It crackled, it sparked, wrapped around him in a perfect technical deployment representing thousands of engineering hours and millions in development. And then Goten sneezed. Involuntary reflex. Completely unintentional. The passive key field disrupting around his body for 1 unguarded millisecond detonated all 4 drones simultaneously and sent the Quinjet spinning through 300 feet of airspace before the pilot compensated. Not an attack, a sneeze. Peter watched the Quinjet recover and had time to think, this is going to go so badly, before the next wave came in. Iron Man, repaired to 60%, arrived with War Machine flanking and Captain Marvel dropping from altitude like a comet. Tony's voice cut through every comm channel, clipped and precise, carrying the tension of a man converting pure fear into problem-solving in real time. Non-lethal approach, layered force, keep distance, do not, I repeat, do not engage close quarters. Everyone acknowledged, except Peter, who was still 20 feet from Goten, watching his expression shift, not to fear, not to aggression, to something quieter. The recognition that this was going to be a fight whether he wanted one or not. Peter had seen that expression before. He saw it every time he looked in a mirror before a bad day. Carol came in first. She always did when the situation called for overwhelming physical presence. Hit the atmosphere at combat speed. Pulled up 30 feet above the crater, projected a photon energy field that had stopped Kree warships dead. A warning, a display. The superhero equivalent of puffing up to look bigger. Completely reasonable against any enemy who understood the social grammar of superhero conflict. Goten didn't understand that grammar. What he understood was that something bright and fast came at him from above, and his body responded before conscious thought could catch up. A reflexive burst of ki met Carol's photon field head-on and produced an explosion that registered on seismographs in 4 states. Carol hit a building. Not gently. Thor scalars, drop a comment. How do you think Carol's binary mode actually stacks up against base Saiyan Kai? Because the numbers here were already breaking Marvel's math. War Machine opened up with everything. Rhodes was a military man with genuine tactical discipline, deploying his weapons package with more precision and professional care than the situation arguably deserved. It also accomplished absolutely nothing. The rounds hit Goten's passive Kai field, not his active defense, his passive field, the baseline energy his body radiated at rest and scattered, not deflected, not absorbed, scattered, like throwing gravel at a running river. Goten turned to look at War Machine with giant puzzlement, the expression of someone who felt a tap on the shoulder and cannot locate its source. Then he looked at his own hands, checking for damage he already knew wasn't there. The cameras caught that moment perfectly. A child looking at his hands and finding them clean. That image went around the world in minutes and meant completely different things to everyone who saw it. The seismograph readings broke it open publicly. When the data hit civilian channels, when geologists and engineers and ordinary people started mapping what the pressure readings implied, started calculating yield equivalents, started comparing numbers against known catastrophic events, the mood of the city changed. It had been disaster curious until then. This was different. These numbers implied something that didn't fit inside the framework of manageable. They implied something that reduced every conflict this city had ever survived to the category of practice runs. People started leaving. Not in panic. In the quiet, deliberate way people leave when they've done the math and don't like the answer. Traffic systems collapsed, transit buckled, and above the crater, 3 of Marvel Earth's most powerful active heroes were regrouping, damaged, staring at a child who hadn't even fully committed to the fight yet. Strange arrived at altitude, cloak spreading like dark wings. He scanned, reached through every layer of metaphysical awareness he possessed, tried to find the thread of ki he could pull, the frequency he could counter, contain, redirect. Found the same thing Xavier found but experienced it differently. Not a boy searching for familiarity, an energy that existed completely outside his reference architecture. Ki wasn't in his catalog, it didn't fit any containment framework he had. It was something that had evolved in a different universe according to different rules, and it no more fit his systems than light fits a bucket. For the first time in a very long time, Dr. Stephen Strange hovered above a crisis and genuinely didn't know what to do next. Then Goten looked up and found Strange across the distance, and for one moment, just a moment, the fight paused, both of them still, the city holding its breath. And Goten's expression in that moment was the one cameras would replay for years. Analysts would argue about it in journals and forums and late-night discussions for as long as anyone remembered this day. It wasn't anger, it wasn't defiance, it was something far worse. Loneliness. Raw and uncomplicated. The loneliness of a child far from home, surrounded by strangers who kept trying to hurt him and couldn't seem to understand he didn't want to be there either. Strange saw it, almost reached for it. Then the second shield tactical wing opened fire. The moment shattered, and whatever window had briefly existed closed hard. First came confusion, then the loneliness, then the realization that nobody was going to stop long enough to ask why he was here before deciding what to do about him. In the Dragon Ball universe, that sequence had a very specific outcome, one that every hero currently regrouping around the crater was about to learn the hard way. By hour 3, the story had outgrown the crater. That was the thing about Goten's presence that no tactical briefing could capture. It didn't stay contained to the impact point the way conventional threats did. A Chitauri invasion had a front line, a Hydra operation had a command structure, even a rampaging Hulk had a trajectory you could model and predict and eventually redirect. Goten had none of those things because Ghost 10 wasn't an operation, he was a presence, and presences radiate outward in ways that front lines and trajectories cannot. By hour 3, the fractures were everywhere simultaneously. Government emergency sessions, Xavier's mansion, Doom's war room, living rooms of ordinary people watching footage their brains kept rejecting as real. The Avengers split along lines that had always existed but rarely mattered this much. Tony called it a containment problem and meant it, not coldly, but with the single-mindedness of an engineer who converts every crisis into a solvable system. Isolate the variable, stabilize the system. He was already building a theoretical framework for neutralizing key energy, a framework that rested entirely on the assumption that Kai followed rules. It did, just not his. Carol backed the approach because Carol's instinct had always leaned toward decisive physical resolution. She wasn't wrong as a general principle. She was catastrophically wrong about this specific situation in ways that would take hours more to understand. Natasha said nothing and began quietly drafting a third option neither of them was going to like. In Westchester, the conversation ran at a different tempo. Xavier sat at its center, projecting the deliberate calm he always projected when most deeply unsettled. He'd felt Goten's mind. He knew what was there, and what was there wasn't a weapon, a conqueror, or an alien intelligence operating on incomprehensible logic. It was a child experiencing the specific emotional cocktail of displacement and confusion and mounting frustration that Xavier had spent his entire career trying to prevent from becoming something worse. He'd seen it in his students, in frightened mutants cornered by people who feared them before understanding them. He knew with the certainty of long experience that the next few hours were not a military problem. They were a communication problem, a trust problem, the most expensive kind. Because the cost of getting it wrong wasn't paid in equipment or infrastructure. It was paid in the kind of damage that doesn't show up on seismographs. Scott Summers wanted to go in. Logan had already put his jacket on, which meant he'd already decided and was waiting for the discussion to finish. Jean had touched the edges of Goten's mind from Westchester's range, and what she'd found was layered and heartbreaking in proportion to how simple it actually was. Underneath the confusion, underneath the mounting frustration, underneath the battle-ready instincts beginning to warm up in response to constant provocation, there was homesickness. Clean, uncomplicated, profound. He wanted his mother. He wanted Trunks. He was not looking for a fight. He'd simply been given so many of them in such rapid succession that fighting was becoming the only framework the situation was offering him. Jean pulled back, opened her eyes, looked at Xavier. He nodded. They both understood what the next few hours required. The question was whether they could get there before someone closed the option permanently. Doom had been watching since impact, receiving the shield alert 40 seconds early, running his own analysis, cross-referencing against every dimensional event in his personal archive. He'd determined the energy wasn't magic and wasn't technology. It was something anterior to both, something existing in a layer of physical reality that Marvel Sciences hadn't formally acknowledged. He'd calculated, conservatively, that a full deliberate power output from this entity would exceed every defensive system Latveria possessed. And he'd decided, with the clean, ruthless clarity that made Doom both terrifying and in certain narrow respects admirably honest, that the correct response was not destruction, it was acquisition. He began making calls to people who occupied the useful middle space where capability exceeded scruple. Doom didn't collaborate. He orchestrated. The city was changing around Goten in ways that had nothing to do with him directly and everything to do with what he represented. Evacuation had reached 6 blocks. Beyond that radius, gridlock, infrastructure collapse, the particular chaos of emergency systems encountering a threat they weren't designed for. A news anchor 12 blocks away described Goten as the most significant threat since the Chitauri invasion, then paused, visibly reconsidered, said more quietly, "Perhaps since anything." Her producers flagged the line, didn't pull it, because it was accurate. The matchups came in waves, not as organized tactics, but as overlapping consequence of multiple factions responding independently. Thor arrived and hit Goten with a lightning strike that would have leveled a mountain range. Goten took it on his forearm, not with a dramatic block, with the casual interception of someone brushing away something mildly surprising. The thunder rolled across 5 boroughs. Thor landed, looked at Mjolnir, looked at Goten, and experienced, possibly for the first time in 1,000 years, the specific emotion of genuinely not knowing what the next move should be. He wasn't afraid. He was recalibrating. For Thor, that was slower and more costly. Goten looked at him with something approaching recognition. Of all the beings he'd encountered since arrival, this one at least felt familiar. Big, powerful, a fighter. Something in Goten's posture eased slightly, the way a person relaxes when they finally hear a language they recognize in a foreign country. Jean reached him differently. She didn't go physically. She stayed at Westchester's range and pushed her awareness outward with extraordinary delicacy, not trying to read him or influence him, just making contact, letting him know that something out there recognized him as a person rather than a problem. What she found was layered and heartbreaking. He wanted to go home. He was homesick in a way that was clean and uncomplicated and profound, and every attack he'd absorbed since landing had confirmed what fear always confirms, that the world around you is hostile, and the only language it speaks is force. Jean pulled back. She and Xavier looked at each other. They knew exactly what was at stake. The question was whether they could get there before someone eliminated the option. Because in the spaces between the heroic factions and the governmental panic and Doom's cold maneuvering, something else was already moving, something patient, something that had identified the exact emotional opening Jean had just confirmed, and the hands reaching for it were neither heroic nor confused. They were ancient, precise, and entirely comfortable with turning a lost child's loneliness into a directed catastrophe. Loki had been watching since the beginning. That was important to understand about Loki. He was rarely the first to act, almost never the loudest voice, because first movers and loud voices were always the most visible. Visibility was a liability when your primary advantage was that people underestimated the depth of your patience. He'd watched Tony get thrown through a parking garage, watched Thor's lightning get parried like a nuisance, watched Strange hover in that moment of rare uncertainty. He'd cataloged all of it carefully because Strange's uncertainty was valuable currency. It meant conventional defenses were failing, which meant unconventional approaches were about to become the only approaches, which meant the field was opening for someone operating entirely outside the playbook. He arrived without spectacle, materialized at the crater's edge during a lull. Combatants pulled back to regroup, Goten momentarily alone, sitting on rubble, watching the sky with exhausted confusion. Loki took in the scene, the destruction, the passive energy shimmer, the posture of a child who'd been fighting for hours, not because he wanted to, but because nothing else had been offered. He sat down on a nearby chunk of concrete like this was the most natural meeting place in the world, crossed one leg over the other, said nothing, just sat, waited. Goten looked at him. Loki looked back. No weapons, no energy signature, no posturing. Just a man in green and gold sitting in a crater with the patient, companionable silence of someone who'd decided this particular individual was worth unhurried attention. In a day full of people who'd responded to his presence with weapons or analysis or fear, this was so different it registered as physically strange. Goten's key field, flickering with the irregular rhythm of sustained emotional stress, smoothed. Slightly. Enough. Loki noted it the way a chess player notes a tempo shift, without expression, without acknowledgement, with everything. He waited 30 more seconds, then spoke, not in English but in a constructed resonance between telepathy and magic, carrying meaning directly beneath words. Simple, unchallenging. I am not here to fight you. What followed wasn't a conversation. It was attunement. Loki carefully, incrementally adjusting the frequency of his communication to match what Goten was already feeling. So every exchange felt less like receiving information and more like having your own thoughts reflected back in a slightly more coherent form. He didn't lie immediately. That was the craft. Early lies are always detectable because they conflict with observed reality. He began with things that were absolutely true. You didn't ask to be here. These people attacked you first. You haven't done anything wrong. Building credibility on accuracy before beginning the slow work of redirection. Goten couldn't parse the words, but he felt the emotional register. And the register said, "This one sees me correctly. That was enough to keep him listening. The heroes weren't idle. Peter had spotted Loki's approach and was already moving, trying to get close without triggering another key response. Strange had identified the magical resonance from altitude and understood immediately what was happening. Not the specifics, but the structure, the patient grooming of an emotional state toward a desired outcome, and was calculating intercept options that wouldn't rupture the fragile calm. Tony was running voice analysis and translation deals from Goten's vocalizations. The models kept returning null results. The phonetic structure didn't match any linguistic family in his database. They were working. They were trying. They were collectively about 12 minutes too slow. Because Loki had shifted into Phase 2. Still no explicit lies. Goten's emotional intelligence was sharp in the way of children raised around powerful, complicated people. The second phase was reframing. Not the heroes are your enemies, too crude, too easily tested. Instead, the heroes are afraid of you, and frightened people make poor decisions, and the decisions they're currently making are going to get worse before they get better, and the only reason you're still here is that they haven't agreed on which poor decision to implement first. All of it true. Loki never needed to fabricate a conspiracy when reality was already conspiratorial enough. He just needed to present truth through a frame that served his purposes. And then he offered what Goten wanted most, a way home. Which was also, in the most technically narrow sense, true. Loki knew dimensional mechanics. He could, in theory, open a path. Where that path actually led was a separate question Goten wasn't yet positioned to ask. Xavier broke in, not carefully, with force, sacrificing finesse for speed, because he'd been reading the emotional temperature and understood what was happening and knew that subtlety had run out of runway. He pushed through the distance and made direct contact. Not words, not images. Pure emotional content, the way a hand on a shoulder communicates things sentences cannot. Wait, not this one. This one is telling you a story. Goten flinched. Not from pain, but from surprise. Xavier's touch was the first genuinely non-aggressive contact from this universe's inhabitants. Clean warmth, pressing against his awareness like sunlight through glass. Loki felt the intervention and pivoted instantly. They're in your mind now. They're trying to control you. This is exactly what I warned you about. The moment trembled on its axis. Two interpretations of the same event. One true. One wearing the clothes of truth. Jean pushed through alongside Xavier then. Not with argument or counter-narrative, but with herself. Her genuine distress. Her genuine recognition of his loneliness. The honest, unmanufactured empathy of someone who'd spent her entire life in a world that feared what she was and had learned to distinguish between the fear and the person underneath it. It wasn't a tactic. It was just real, and realness has a different texture than performance. Goten went still. He looked at Loki with new eyes, not hostile yet, questioning. The eyes of someone who has just noticed that one of two things they're being told cannot be completely true. Loki saw the calculation failing, made a decision, stopped being subtle, reached into the resonance construct and shifted from attunement to activation, pushing toward Goten's fear. The deep Saiyan fear of being trapped, contained, restrained, that had been building for hours beneath confusion and loneliness. It hit like a switch. Goten stood. His Kai field went from shimmer to visible corona. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in 2 seconds. His hair began to rise. Peter, swinging in from the crater's edge, had time to think very clearly. Oh no, before the air pressure hit him like a wall. Strange threw up a barrier that lasted 1 second. Xavier and Jean recoiled from the emotional surge blazing through the mental connection. And Loki smiled. Not because the plan had fully worked, because it had worked well enough. Ugh. Chaos was its own kind of control. In chaos, the patient observer always had the most options. The transformation began. Not full, not yet, but golden light blazed up from Goten's body in a column visible from Jersey. Every camera in the city caught it simultaneously. The shockwave from the key release alone shattered windows in a 2-block radius. Above the crater, the sky that had almost finished healing cracked open again. Not into another universe, but simply from the pressure. Reality's surface developing stress fractures under the weight of power not native to it. Strange looked at the transformation light and felt something he rarely felt. Not fear exactly. The sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff you hadn't seen until your foot was already over it. Loki was already gone. He had what he needed. The seed was planted, and somewhere in his plan, a door was opening that nobody was watching, because they were all staring at the boy blazing gold in the crater. The golden light did not fade. That was the first thing everyone noticed, the detail separating this from every previous superhero incident in Manhattan's battered history. After every battle, after every explosion and energy release, there was always a moment where the light died and the smoke cleared and the damage could be assessed. The golden light from Goten's transformation held, blazed at a steady, furious, unwavering intensity that turned the sky into something resembling the surface of a star. Every instrument pointed at it plateaued at maximum reading and stayed there, not because the readings had stopped, but because they'd gone somewhere the instruments couldn't follow. Thor understood fastest. 1,000 years of fighting things that operated at planetary scales develops a threat calibration instinct that bypasses analysis and arrives directly at recognition. He'd felt the lightning parry, filed it under exceptional strength, unclear ceiling. He was looking at the transformation now and filing it under something that had no category in his experience, something that rhymed with the moments he'd faced entities he genuinely wasn't certain he could stop. He tightened his grip on Mjolnir, did not charge. That restraint, from Thor, communicated more than any tactical briefing could have. If Thor was waiting, hitting harder was no longer the answer. Carol didn't get that memo in time. She came in from the east at full binary output, light blazing white, the kind of energy she reserved for Kree fleet engagements. Hit Goten with a focused photon beam that could punch through a warship hull. It connected, cleanly, dead center. Goten took half a step back, one half step. He looked at his chest where the beam hit, then up at Carol with faint academic curiosity, the expression of someone tapped on the shoulder by something they hadn't expected to feel and found mildly interesting. She hit him again, harder, drawing from reserves she almost never touched. Quarter step. Carol had enough combat experience to read what that meant. What it meant hit her below conscious thought, somewhere in the part of a warrior's mind that deals in survival mathematics. She pulled back. And here's the question for anyone in the comments. Do you actually think anyone on Carol's tier can damage Goten? Or does Marvel's cosmic ceiling not apply here at all? The collateral damage was not Goten's fault. That made it worse. The ki radiating from his transformed state wasn't directed, not aimed at buildings or evacuation routes. It simply existed the way heat exists around fire. Not aggressive, not intentional, just the passive consequence of containing that much energy in one place. But passive consequences at this scale were structurally indistinguishable from deliberate attack. The ground within a 100-yard radius vibrated at subsonic frequency, cracking foundations, popping windows, sending fault lines through pavement in radiating patterns. 3 buildings at the crater's edge showed structural distress. The sky directly above took on a color that didn't exist in the standard visible spectrum. Pilots at altitude reported nausea when looking toward it directly. Tony was running 3 simultaneous conversations, with Strange on containment theory, with a UN Security Council representative demanding status updates he couldn't honestly provide, and with Friday modeling energy dispersal scenarios, none of which concluded with the city intact. He pulled Strange's thread to the front because Strange was the most honest, and Tony needed accurate information more than reassuring information. Strange's assessment was precise and brutal. Key emissions at current levels were exceeding the Sanctum's ward capacity. The dimensional fractures opening above the crater weren't healing the way dimensional wounds normally healed. And if Goten moved to a second transformation stage, if there was a second stage, and everything Strange was reading suggested there was, the cascading release would exceed anything Earth-6 once seen had frameworks to manage. Tony asked how far above Hulk's output they were talking. Strange was quiet for 1 second, then said, "I'm not comparing this to the Hulk, Tony." Tony closed that conversation. The X-Men arrived navigating atmospheric distortion because Aurora was flying the Blackbird from the outside, managing air currents manually, her weather control working against key-generated pressure waves to keep a corridor stable. She'd never worked against an energy source with no atmospheric logic. Wind and pressure followed rules she understood intuitively. This energy obeyed different rules entirely. She felt them but couldn't fully parse them. She held the corridor anyway. Logan was out before the landing struts fully deployed. Xavier stayed on the plane, not from fear, but calculation. His presence on the ground would split focus between psychic work and physical threat, and the psychic work was the only work with any real chance of mattering. He reached for Goten again, this time without delicacy, pushing through the transformation's energy with genuine force, and pushing through it felt like walking into a gale. He found Goten's mind at the center, still there, still recognizably the boy he'd briefly touched hours before, but buried now under layers of activated Saiyan biology, fight response, Loki's seated panic, the accumulated emotional damage of a day spent being attacked for reasons he couldn't access. Xavier didn't try to talk him down. Talking down was for situations where the person was still primarily thinking. He broadcast instead, pure, wordless, indiscriminate emotional content, safety, recognition. You are known, you are not just a threat. You are known, like shouting into a storm. He did it anyway. Jean was doing something more dangerous. She'd moved to the crater's edge physically, over Scott's explicit objection, over Logan's growled warning, and she was standing at the threshold of the key field with golden light blazing around her and her own psionic energy visible as a faint rose-gold corona around her head. And she was talking, not transmitting, actually talking out loud into the noise and the light and the pressure. Talking the way you talk to someone too frightened to hear words properly. Not for semantic content, but for tone, cadence, the undeniable humanness of a voice trying without agenda. She told him it was okay. She told him she knew he was scared. She told him, and this was the most honest thing anyone had said to him all day, that this was not his fault. The golden light pulsed, enormous, concussive, knocked every hero in the area off their feet and cracked pavement in rings outward like a struck bell. Then it did something nobody expected. It dimmed, not extinguished, not surrendered, dimmed fractionally, the way a held breath releases when something frightening retreats one step. Goten was still transformed, still blazing, but his face had changed. The anger was there, the fear too. But something else had arrived alongside them. Something that looked unmistakably like a question. The very first opening of the possibility that this world contained something other than enemies. Jean kept talking. Xavier kept broadcasting. The world held itself very still and tried not to do anything that would close that opening back up. It almost worked. Victor Von Doom had been patient for 6 hours. By his own accounting, that was 5 hours and 50 minutes longer than the situation deserved. He'd watched the heroes scramble, watched Loki plant his seed and retreat, watched Jean Grey begin the slow, admirable work of reaching through transformation fury to the boy underneath. He'd assessed it all with the dispassionate clarity that was Doom's primary advantage, the ability to observe crisis without being emotionally enrolled in it, to watch catastrophe the way an architect watches construction, evaluating structural choices rather than feeling the weight of the steel. And what he'd concluded was that the heroes were going to succeed. Jean was going to reach Goten. The transformation was going to recede, and the extraordinary resource currently standing in that crater would be gone before anyone had extracted a fraction of its potential value. Unacceptable. He moved through channels built specifically for situations where direct action was inadvisable. Contacted an IM cell he'd been running as a double asset for 3 years. Gave them specific technical instructions about the dimensional stress fractures visible in the sky above the crater. Told them what to introduce into those fractures, and when. Contacted a SHIELD deputy director whose particular vulnerability he'd been maintaining for future use and suggested, through several degrees of separation, that the current de-escalation approach was naive. Sent notification to Kang. Not collaboration. Doom didn't collaborate, because Kang's temporal operations would create variables he preferred to account for in advance. Then he put on his armor and prepared to arrive at precisely the moment the situation had deteriorated enough to require the specific intervention only he could provide. Timing was everything. Doom was very good at timing. The AIM operatives intra adduced their payload at the worst possible moment, which was the moment Doom had specified. because it was the moment of maximum leverage. Jean had reached Goten. She was inside the emotional space, broadcasting warmth and recognition and the steady message that something in this world saw him as a person. His transformation had dimmed 30%. His key field had pulled inward. Strange was holding. Scott had stopped pressing his hands against the Blackbird viewport. Logan had sheathed one set of claws. The situation was, improbably, trending towards something that was not catastrophe. And then the dimensional fractures were hit with a targeted resonance pulse. And the fractures didn't close. They expanded. The sound had no center. It came from everywhere simultaneously. A tearing that registered less as audio and more as the sudden wrongness of a world that had developed a flaw in its basic structural integrity. Every psychic in range experienced it as a simultaneous white flash, a hard reset of the mental landscape. The contact Jean had been maintaining, the careful living thread of trust she'd spent 20 minutes building across the language barrier and the Kai storm, snapped, not frayed, snapped clean. Goten felt it as sudden silence where there had been warmth. In the Dragon Ball universe, sudden silence after warmth was not neutral. It was what happened right before something terrible. His ki flared back to full transformation intensity in under 2 seconds. Jean was thrown backward, caught by Scott. Xavier was pushed back against the plane's interior, the psychic backlash hitting like a physical blow. The dimming reversed. The color left the sky, and the dimensional fractures, forcibly widened and destabilized, began to do something that several people had nightmares about for months afterward. They began to pull. Not pushing energy out, drawing energy in, creating a localized dimensional undertow that latched onto the nearest large energy source with the mindless physical greed of a vortex finding a drain. The nearest source was Goten. The fractures began feeding on his transformation ki, which meant the more he powered up in response, the more the fractures grew, and the more the fractures grew, the more aggressively they fed. The ceiling of that loop wasn't visible from where anyone was standing. Strange threw everything at the fractures simultaneously. Every containment technique and dimensional suture in his arsenal, deployed in combinations he was inventing in real time. He slowed the expansion. He didn't stop it. The pull on Goten's energy moderated from catastrophic to severe, buying minutes rather than seconds. Wong materialized beside him. Between them, they held the line at a cost visible in Strange's shaking hands. Not from effort, Strange's hands were famously precise under pressure, but from the fundamental wrongness of working against an energy his magic kept failing to properly engage. You can't suture a wound with thread that passes through the tissue without catching. Doom descended from a Latverian transport with the composed gravity of someone satisfied with his entrance, landed at the crater's edge, surveyed the scene, 2 seconds of visible assessment, then cut through the chaos with a voice engineered by a lifetime of Maki. Nengrooms, listen. Your containment approach is incorrect. The fractures require counter-resonance, not a seal. Strange knows this and is doing it anyway because he has no alternative. I have an alternative. Nobody asked what it was. In situations this bad, even people who despised Doom listened when he said he had a solution. The solution was real. Genuinely, technically correct. A counter-resonance approach that would destabilize the AIM payload and allow the fractures to naturally heal. Strange recognized it immediately as superior to his current approach and began implementing it within 30 seconds, despite every instinct screaming that accepting Doom's help in a crisis was the opening move in a sequence that ended badly. The fractures began stabilizing. The feedback loop's ceiling came back into view. Strange allowed himself one fraction of relief, then noticed what the solution required as a side condition. A precise directional shunt of the fractured dimensional energy toward a collection point. The collection point was a device Doom had produced from his armor with the casualness of a man retrieving something prepared specifically for this moment. He was harvesting everything. The fracture energy, the leaked Kai, the exotic matter produced by the interaction of Dragon Ball physics and Marvel metaphysics. Strange stared at him. He couldn't interrupt the collection without collapsing the fracture stabilization that was the only thing preventing the feedback loop from resuming. Doom had engineered his own indispensability, and Strange, trapped by the mechanism of his own rescue, could only watch. Doom spoke to Goten directly then, the same resonance construct Loki had used, but stripped of manipulation, delivering meaning with clean directness. What he said was simple. I can send you home. I have what I need to do it. Come to Latveria. Technically true. The parts he didn't transmit were the other truths. That the path wouldn't open immediately, that Goten wouldn't be going home before Doom had extracted everything extractable, that home in Doom's vocabulary was a destination that could be postponed indefinitely while remaining technically promised. These were truths that required very specific life experience to recognize. Goten was 13. He looked at Doom, felt the promise inside the resonance, felt the desperate, completely human want to believe someone in this world was going to help him get back. His key flickered, his transformation wavered. Strange watched it happen and understood exactly what was occurring and understood with equal clarity that he could not stop it without destroying the fracture stabilization. He was trapped by the mechanism of his own rescue. And Doom, behind the mask, felt something click into final position. Not victory. Not yet. But the door he'd spent 6 hours opening was now open. And on the other side was the most powerful thing he'd ever had the opportunity to control. Everything that followed was going to be Doom's fault. He'd designed it that way from the beginning. Goten did not go to Latveria willingly. That was the detail Doom had miscalculated, not the technical architecture. That was as precise as everything Doom built. The human element, which Doom consistently underweighted because he found it theoretically uninteresting. What broke the moment wasn't a tactical intervention or Strange finding the thread he needed. It was Peter Parker. Peter, who'd been thrown across 2 blocks by a pressure wave and spent 20 minutes climbing back through rubble and Kai-distorted air with his spider sense drilling behind his eyes, arrived at the crater's edge at the exact moment Goten was looking at Doom's offered hand and wanting to believe it. Peter looked at the scene. Looked at Doom's posture, the carefully engineered magnanimity of it, the performance of sincerity from a man constitutionally incapable of sincerity. Then he looked at Goten, and he did the only thing he could think of, which was also the only thing with any chance of working. He stepped in front of Doom, and he took off his mask. He showed Goten his face, not as a tactical gambit, not as a calculated move in a larger strategy, because he was a kid from Queens who'd spent his entire superhero life believing that the most powerful thing you could offer someone scared and alone was the honest sight of another person who was also, underneath everything, just trying. He was bruised. He had a cut above his eyebrow that had bled down his face and dried there. He looked tired and a little frightened and completely genuine. He'd been taught a painful lesson once about what power meant without responsibility. And right now, looking at a terrified kid with the power to end the world, Peter knew the most responsible thing he could do was to stop fighting. He pointed at Doom and shook his head, once, clearly, then pointed at himself and held out his empty hand, not commanding, not restraining, offering, the way you offer a hand to someone standing too close to an edge. Goten looked at the hand, looked at the face, looked at the cut above the eyebrow, the dried blood of someone who'd been thrown through buildings and come back anyway, who was standing here with no mask and no weapons and nothing but an open hand. And that small, specific human detail landed somewhere beneath all the Saiyan biology and the panic and Loki's seated fear, landed in the part that was just a boy who missed his family. Doom moved. Of course he did. Reached for Goten with the containment matrix, trying to lock the energy before sentiment could derail the plan. Strange had been waiting for exactly this. The moment Doom's attention shifted from fracture stabilization to Goten, the structure of his indispensability shifted with it, and Strange moved into the gap, throwing containment not at Goten but at the matrix, wrapping the collection device in the crimson bands before it could fully engage. Doom countered. Strange held. They were evenly matched in this specific exchange, which meant neither was doing anything else, which meant the crater was, for approximately 15 seconds, completely without active hostile intervention. 15 seconds. Peter kept his hand extended. Jean, recovering with her ears still ringing, pushed the last reserves of her psionic strength into one final broadcast. Not words, not concepts, just the warmth she'd been transmitting before AIM tore it away. Rebuilt from scratch. Offered again without qualification. Goten took Peter's hand, tentatively, the way someone takes a hand when they're not certain the ground is solid, testing the weight-bearing capacity of trust with the instinct of someone who's been dropped before. Peter didn't grip. Let Goten's hand rest in his and stayed completely still, keeping the expression on his face exactly what it was. Relief so profound it was almost painful. Goten's ki began to recede. Not kola. Pi si. Recede. The controlled pulling back of power a trained fighter performs when choosing to stand down rather than being forced to. The only version of de-escalation that didn't feel like defeat to Saiyan biology. The golden light diminished in pulses. The transformation held for 30 more seconds, then released. Goten returning to base form with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been operating at maximum emotional and physical intensity all day, and had finally been given permission to stop. He didn't fall. He swayed slightly, caught himself, and looked around at the crater with the eyes of someone seeing the full scope of the damage for the first time without the filter of combat adrenaline. What he saw was catastrophic. The word was insufficient. 3 city blocks structurally compromised, 7 buildings showing critical damage. Streets a topography of broken asphalt and scattered vehicles, and the detritus of a city shaken repeatedly by energies it wasn't built to withstand. Emergency services flooding in. Fire, medical, structural assessment. Their radio traffic carrying the particular tone of professionals encountering a scale that was testing even professional equanimity. Goten heard the sirens without understanding them. He felt the scope without any measurement system to calculate it. What he had instead of data was the emotional weight pressing against him from every direction, the distress radiating from people flooding the streets, the grief in John's ongoing broadcast she couldn't fully suppress. The way Peter's expression had shifted from relief to something more sorrowful. He couldn't speak English, couldn't ask questions or receive answers. What he could do was feel the weight. He stood in it, and his face did something the cameras captured in images reproduced in newspapers and journals for years afterward. He looked like a child who has broken something irreplaceable while playing and has only just understood it cannot be put back together. Not guilt exactly. Something purer and more devastating than guilt. The expression of someone confronting the gap between intention and consequence for the first time, at a scale they cannot metabolize. Thor landed beside Peter and Goten with a heaviness that was not physical. The heaviness of a warrior who'd been in enough battles to recognize the silence that follows one. He looked at Goten for a long moment, then did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He sat down on the rubble across from the boy, Mjolnir resting beside him, not threatening, not diplomatic, not tactical, simply present. The companionship of one being who understood what it was to be far from home and dangerously powerful in a world that couldn't easily contain either fact. There was no translation needed. Goten looked at him with the recognition he'd shown hours before. This one is a fighter, this one I understand, and some of the dimensional isolation lifted, replaced by something smaller and warmer and considerably less explosive. The battle was over. That consensus was spreading through every comm channel and monitoring station simultaneously. The battle was over. What remained wasn't victory. It wasn't resolution. It was the smoking, cracked, enormous question of what came next. For the city, for the heroes, for the boy sitting in the rubble. And underneath all of it, unresolved, the question that Loki had planted and Doom had tried to harvest and Jean had tried to heal, and Peter had temporarily answered with an empty hand and an honest face. What had this world made Goten into over the course of one Thursday? And what did that making say about the world that had done it? The golden light was gone. The sky was gray and fractured and slow, painfully beginning to knit. And in the center of everything, a boy sat in the wreckage of a fight he'd never wanted, and understood more than anyone had given him credit for, and understood it too late. The city counted its wounds slowly, the way cities always do. The numbers came in increments, fed into crisis management systems that had been designed for disasters and were discovering category by category that this one required new categories. Structural assessments, displacement figures, infrastructure damage indices requiring upward revision as engineering teams penetrated deeper and found damage the exterior surveys had underestimated because the passive Chi field had done things to internal structural integrity that didn't manifest visibly until someone was inside the building asking it to bear weight. These weren't the worst numbers the city had ever generated, but they came with a different quality of weight because they'd been generated by a child who hadn't wanted to generate them. And that distinction wouldn't leave the conversation, no matter how many times anyone tried to redirect it toward logistics. Peter didn't let go of Goten's hand for 40 minutes. The cameras kept returning to it. Not the confrontation with Doom, not the containment drama, not any of the spectacle that had defined the previous hours. They returned to a bruised kid from Queens sitting in rubble holding the hand of someone who couldn't understand a word he was saying. Peter talked anyway, steadily, quietly, about Queens. About his aunt, about the first time he'd failed to stop something bad from happening, and how long it had taken him to understand that failure wasn't the same as fault, that the gap between intention and consequence was real and painful but not the final word on anyone's worth. He didn't know if any of it was reaching Goten in any meaningful sense. He kept talking anyway. It was the only thing he knew how to do that felt true to the moment. Xavier finally left the plane. Came across the rubble, positioned himself within range without approaching too closely, respecting the invisible perimeter of a person who'd been cornered and attacked all day and needed space to hold as their own. He didn't push psychically, simply made himself present, his emotional state open and unhidden in the way projecting telepaths can make themselves open, readable without agenda. He was an old man in a chair in a broken city, and he was not afraid of the boy in front of him. Not performing the absence of fear, genuinely unafraid. He'd spent his entire life sitting across from power that frightened other people and finding the person inside it. This was not different in kind, only in scale. The political consequences arrived faster than the healing. They always did. Within 6 hours, 3 governmental bodies had convened emergency sessions demanding answers the superhero community didn't yet have. Within 12, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for joint investigation into both the dimensional breach and the adequacy of response frameworks deployed against Goten. The resolution didn't use the word failure, which was the diplomatic equivalent of using it in every sentence. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s director spent 4 hours in closed testimony explaining decision trees that had seemed reasonable at the time and sounded in retrospect like a catalog of escalatory mistakes. Tony briefed a committee on technical response limitations and found himself, for the first time in his experience of these briefings, unable to confidently assert that better technology would have produced a better outcome. That uncertainty cost him more than the cracked ribs. The debate about Goten himself fractured along predictable and unpredictable lines simultaneously. There were those who focused on the damage, those who focused on the causes, AIM's intervention, Loki's manipulation, Doom's engineering of the crisis's worst moments, and argued that Goten had been as much a victim of Marvel Earth as Marvel Earth had been of him, and those, mostly in Xavier's orbit, who pointed to what the day had demonstrated about how this world responded to power it didn't understand. That Goten was less a cause than a diagnostic, a stress test that had revealed the fault lines in Marvel Earth's entire approach to the extraordinary. None of these positions were entirely wrong. The argument between them would continue long after Goten was gone. Drop a comment. Who do you think is most responsible for how this escalated? The heroes who struck first? S.H.I.E.L.D.'s protocols? Loki? Doom? Or is this genuinely everyone's failure at once? Doom was released from the Crimson Bands within 24 hours because the legal architecture for holding Victor Von Doom was, as always, insufficient. He left the scene with the composed unhurriedness of someone who'd gotten enough of what he came for and would return to the rest in due course. His parting words to Strange, delivered quietly, no theater as he passed, were 6 words Strange replayed for weeks. "You cannot seal every door, Stephen." Then he was gone, and the absence of him felt like the absence of a weight you hadn't realized you were carrying. Except with Doom, the lightness was never reassuring, because the weight hadn't disappeared, it had only relocated. Strange worked the dimensional mechanics with Wong for 72 hours, trying to construct a stable return path using partial data from Doom's matrix, because Doom's collection had inadvertently produced the best dataset they were going to get on the interaction between Dragon Ball and Marvel physics, and Strange was not too proud to use it, even if its provenance was unconscionable. The work was slow. The path wasn't obvious. They were opening a door to a universe they had no prior record of, using energy signatures their instruments could measure but their theories couldn't fully model. Goten spent those 72 hours in a shield facility Xavier had insisted must be comfortable rather than secured. Jean visited every day. She brought food, the most consistently successful communication tool they'd found, transcending language barriers entirely. She brought a sketch pad and markers. What emerged was not conversation, but something that wasn't nothing. He drew, she drew in response. His figures were energetic. A tall, spiky-haired man. A smaller boy who might have been a friend. She kept the drawings. She wasn't entirely sure why. It felt important. Tony visited once, stayed an hour, said very little. Left a tablet loaded with mathematics he found beautiful. He didn't know if Goten looked at it. When he checked the activity log that evening, it showed 3 hours of interaction with the mathematics interface. He sat with that information for a long time. Carol sent a formal written statement through official channels expressing regret for the escalation of force during initial contact. It was a good statement. It cost her something to write. She didn't V-ize it. She didn't yet know how to be in a room with someone she'd tried to stop and discovered she couldn't, and she needed more time than 72 hours to understand what that discovery meant. On the third day, Strange found the path. Functional but rough, requiring more energy than he liked and offering a transit window narrower than he was comfortable with. He called everyone who needed to know, and the gathering had the texture of a departure that no one had quite the language for. Jean gave Goten her phone number written on a piece of paper, a gesture that made no practical sense, and both of them understood that. Peter brought food from Queens he couldn't explain, but wanted Goten to have anyway. Xavier simply looked at him for a long moment, then placed one hand very briefly on his arm. Not psychic, just physical. The touch of one person acknowledging another person's complete reality before a separation. Goten looked around at all of them. His expression wasn't the one he'd arrived with, not the confusion of the crater, the fury of the transformation, or the devastating recognition of damage not intended. It was something harder to name and more permanent. The expression of someone who has passed through something and arrived on the other side, different in ways they cannot yet fully inventory. The portal closed at 11:47 a.m. on a Thursday. By noon, the news cycle had already begun converting what had happened into a story it could manage. That's the thing about catastrophe and media. They have a relationship almost biological in its efficiency, feeding each other until raw, unprocessed reality has been reduced to a narrative with clean edges and assignable blame, and a conclusion allowing ordinary life to resume its forward motion. The narrative that emerged over the following weeks wasn't wrong exactly. It captured the facts with reasonable accuracy. What it couldn't capture was the texture of the thing itself. The specific quality of standing in a broken city holding the hand of someone who could have ended the world and had chosen, improbably, not to. The damage assessments finalized over the following month. Structural damage across 12 blocks. Infrastructure repair timelines stretching into years. Displacement numbers that weren't catastrophic but were real, affecting real people with real lives interrupted by something that had nothing to do with them. Compensation frameworks were debated and contested and partially implemented. Scaffolding went up. Construction noise replaced the silence of aftermath. Someone proposed a memorial. The debate about what it should say, who it should commemorate, what it should ask people standing in front of it to feel. That debate continued long after the ground had healed over the place where it would stand. Strange spent 3 weeks running comprehensive audits of Earth 616's dimensional security architecture. What he found was not reassuring. The breach that had introduced Goten wasn't caused by anyone. Doom, S.H.I.E.L.D., any terrestrial actor. It had been spontaneous dimensional instability, the kind the universe produces when membranes between realities develop stress points from accumulated metaphysical pressure. Bad luck. Clean, simple, inarguable bad luck. No one to blame, no mechanism to guarantee it wouldn't happen again. He published his findings, which generated significant discussion and a committee and a set of follow-up reports, and no additional dimensional security infrastructure of any meaningful kind, because the infrastructure required didn't yet exist, and developing it would take decades and resources. No one wanted to formally commit to a problem that had happened once and might not again. Strange filed the committee's conclusions and returned to the sanctum and sat with them in silence for a very long time. Xavier thought about Goten more than he discussed him. What he returned to most often was the moment of initial contact, the boy's mind as he'd first touched it, confused and searching and unmistakably, heartbreakingly alive in the way only genuinely young people are alive, with that specific quality of consciousness that hasn't yet learned to armor itself against the world it's moving through. He'd felt that aliveness in thousands of students. He knew what it was capable of becoming given the right conditions, and what it became instead, given the wrong ones. He thought about what one day in Marvel Earth had done to that particular quality of aliveness. He didn't arrive at a conclusion that sat comfortably. He began drafting modified first contact protocols for the broader superhero community. He didn't expect them to be adopted quickly. He submitted them anyway. It was the only thing he could think of to do with what he'd learned. Jean kept the drawings, framed 2 of them, the tall, spiky-haired figure and the smaller boy, and hung them in her office in Westchester. When students asked, she told the story honestly, without softening the parts that were difficult. The story became a teaching case study in the Institute's institutional memory, circulated among students learning to navigate a world that feared what they were. The lesson it was used to teach wasn't what most people outside the Institute would have predicted. Not about power, not about protocol or defensive response. The lesson was about the first question. How often it doesn't get asked. How much depends on whether it does. 4 words, the only 4 words that had moved anything in the right direction all day. Hey, you okay? Jean taught that lesson every year. She never got tired of it. Doom said nothing publicly. He sat in his castle and reviewed the data from the Matrix and worked with it in the long, methodical way he worked with everything he found genuinely interesting. The exotic matter produced by the interaction of Dragon Ball physics and Marvel metaphysics was, on preliminary analysis, the most unusual substance he'd encountered in a career full of unusual substances. He found himself returning to the data in early mornings, before the demands of running a nation intruded, sitting with it the way a painter sits with a canvas not yet decided how to approach. Patient, anticipatory, already, in some private internal sense, pleased. Loki was never found. The investigation concluded with a comprehensive understanding of what he'd done, and no mechanism to address it. He watched the aftermath from whatever vantage point he currently inhabited and found it, on balance, satisfying. Not because his plan had fully succeeded, it hadn't. The asset was removed before he could fully direct it. But because the day had demonstrated something he already knew and periodically needed reminded of. The Marvel Universe's greatest vulnerability was not any external threat or internal faction or cosmic catastrophe. It was itself, its own fear. Its own inability to agree on what it was looking at before deciding what to do about it. He filed this conclusion alongside several hundred similar conclusions accumulated over centuries. He was very patient. It was perhaps his most genuinely dangerous quality. The questions that lingered were the kind that don't get answered by investigations or committees. They lived in the gap between what had happened and what it meant, and they were different for everyone who carried them. For some, the lingering question was tactical. For others, cosmic. For a few people, Xavier, Jean, Peter, Thor, sitting quietly in the rubble, the question was simpler and less answerable than either. The question was about a boy, about what he'd arrived with and what the day had added to it, about whether the drawn figures in Jean's framed sketches remembered this world, and if they did, what they remembered it as. In the drawer where Peter kept his mask, folded under a spare web shooter and a grocery list for his aunt, there was a small piece of paper he'd written on the night after the portal closed. Late, when he couldn't sleep. When the weight of the day had settled into the specific heaviness that only comes when you've been part of something too large to hold comfortably. The paper said, he was just looking for someone who wasn't scared of him. That's all anyone is ever looking for. He hadn't shown it to anyone. He didn't intend to. Some things were true in a way that needed no audience. The sky above Manhattan healed completely 46 days after the portal closed. A clear morning, cold and blue. No one marked the moment. The last dimensional stress fracture knitted shut in the upper atmosphere without announcement, a wound closing in a world already moving toward its next crisis, its next extraordinary problem, its next test of whether it could be better than its first instinct. Somewhere in another universe, a boy who had spent one Thursday being a disaster was being whatever he was when no one was watching him become one. Neither world knew what the other was doing. The distance between them was once again complete. And in the end, the question was never whether Goten could invade the Marvel Universe. The question was whether the Marvel Universe could survive meeting a child strong enough to destroy it before anyone taught him how not to. And before anyone taught themselves to slow down and ask, before the weapons and the fear took over completely, whether the thing they were so afraid of was also afraid. It could survive. It had, by the narrowest of margins, through the smallest of gestures, at a cost that would take years to fully count. That was not the same as learning. And the next time the sky splits open above a city that thinks it knows what impossible looks like, the margin may not be there. Now here's what I want from you. Who actually handles Goten correctly in this scenario? The Avengers, the X-Men, Doctor Strange, or does someone like Doom end up being the only one who understood what arrived that Thursday? And was Goten the real invader, or did Marvel Earth manufacture its own catastrophe the moment it decided to be afraid before it decided to understand? Tell me in the comments. The debate starts now. And if you want to see what happens when the next rift opens, and something far less patient than Goten falls through, click the video on your screen right now. That story is already waiting.